Thank you. Okay, this is the moment you've all been waiting for. So imagine that you're walking down the street, eating a banana, and you thoughtlessly toss the banana peel on the sidewalk. Then if someone comes along and slips on it, breaks their leg, are you responsible for that broken leg?
Well, even though the relationship may seem indirect, we can all see there's a connection, and therefore, I would say that we do have responsibility. We each have a moral responsibility to be cognizant of our actions and the impacts they have on others.
All right, so to take this a step further, are we then also responsible for our actions with respect to all of creation, and especially for harm we might be doing to our own planet and all the people who live on it?
So yes, following this line of thinking, we are responsible. It's an analogous situation. Everything we do that might seem harmless enough, like tossing out a banana peel, does have an impact on others. But what are the banana peels we're tossing on the earth?
Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to the very beginning of the earth and our existence. We were given an immense gift, the gift of the sun, the earth, and life itself. That life first came into being 3.5 billion years ago on an early earth whose atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide with no oxygen molecules to speak of. Now, if you go to Shark Bay in Western Australia, you will find living remnants of some of the earliest life forms on Earth. These are stromatolites. They are large clumps of cyanobacteria, or colloquially, blue-green algae. This algae, these are the descendants of the original plant life on Earth. So this algae and the higher order plants that followed removed most of the carbon dioxide molecules from the atmosphere and replaced them with oxygen molecules. So they made our present-day atmosphere, which contains about 20% oxygen and only traces of carbon dioxide. So they are what made it possible for oxygen-breathing creatures like us to live. Now, when you look at a massive tree, have you ever thought about where the wood in that tree came from? Well, the wood is made of carbon, and the carbon atoms came from carbon dioxide in the air. In brief, the tree takes in carbon dioxide molecules, uses energy from the sun to strip off the oxygen atoms, which it returns to the air, and then uses the remaining carbon atoms to build its structures. So this is what we mean when we say that trees and all green plants take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. It's a very good thing. It's how the early plant life created the oxygen-rich atmosphere in which we live. But then, when those early plants died, well, they laid down their remnants in layers of carbon that became fossil fuels. Land-based plants became coal buried underground. The ocean-dwelling plankton became oil and natural gas buried under the seafloor. And the carbon that they removed from the atmosphere and incorporated into their bodies when they were alive is now safely buried, where it has remained for eons until we, modern human beings, began to dig it up and burn it. And when we burn those fossil fuels, on one hand, it's a good thing. We fuel our technology-laden lives. We provide food, water, health care, comfortable lives for billions of people. But in the process, we also inadvertently cause problems. In burning the fossil fuels, we return that carbon back into the atmosphere. And then we add even more carbon to the atmosphere by burning down forests, engaging in industrial agriculture, and simply paving over the land. So all of this carbon dioxide gets up in the air where it traps heat and thus causes our planet to become warmer. That is, we have global warming. The impacts of global warming, which we will discuss in a second, are what we call climate change. And the carbon dioxide that triggers all of this is, in effect, the banana peel. So let's look at some of the consequences. As we warm the planet, the sea surface gets warmer. So when storms form, they get excess energy from the warmer ocean and become superstorms. As was the case this week in Southeast Africa with Tropical Cyclone Idai. Warmer air holds more moisture, which causes increased rainfall and consequently catastrophic flooding. This is this week's flood in Mozambique. Those are people waiting to be rescued. And in fact, I read in today's news that there are something like almost 3 million people who need immediate humanitarian relief. There are people who have not eaten for days since this tropical cyclone came by. And also in Nebraska this week, all right? They're saying on the news more than $1 billion of damage to the farm fields. So we're not talking about disasters facing future generations. We're talking about disasters that are happening here and now. Meanwhile, the increased evaporation driven by the warmer air and the disappearing snowpacks, which are melting because of the warmer air, leads to droughts and hence uncontrollable wildfires. And believe it or not, the warming also leads to the polar vortex, right? Everyone here who loves the polar vortex, raise your hand. So it's the imbalance of warming, with the poles warming faster than the equatorial regions, which reduces the amount of energy that goes into the jet stream, right? In normal times, the jet stream just wraps around the upper part of the planet, keeps the cold air near the pole. But now, with the jet stream being weaker, it can no longer hold that strong shape. Think of a slow-moving, meandering river. That's what happens to the jet stream. It gets wavy, and the cold air from the north is able to push down, and sometimes those fingers of cold land right on top of us. And that's the polar vortex. Meanwhile, half of the excess carbon dioxide we produce, and more than 90% of the extra heat we trap, is absorbed by the oceans. As a result, the oceans are becoming warmer and more acidic.
So when you see the coral reefs that are bleached white, as on the right here, they are actually dead or dying. The stress on the reef ecosystem from the warmer, more acidic water causes the coral to expel its algae. And the algae is what makes a healthy coral reef so colorful. So with the algae gone, then the living reef ecosystem is gone with it. And that's what's happening in a widespread way around the world.
That's not bad enough. Did you know about Trichodesmium? It's a bacterium that forms the base of the oceanic food chain, and it's undergoing a massive population explosion. In fact, it's all the white stuff you see here in the ocean in this photo from orbit. Preliminary laboratory experiments suggest that this population explosion may be followed by a catastrophic die-off. At least that's what happens in the laboratory. So if that happens in the real ocean, we're going to lose a significant part of the oceanic food chain, which supplies food to people all around the globe. Phytoplankton, plant-like plankton, that's the green stuff in this photo, also from space. Phytoplankton produces about 70% of the Earth's oxygen. I'll bet you thought it was trees, right? No, some of you know better. Yeah. But, I mean, there's a lot of oceans, so there's a lot of phytoplankton. That's 70% of our oxygen. Problem is that as the temperature increases, the oxygen production decreases. And if you make a simple linear extrapolation from what's going on right now, it suggests that net oxygen production will cease if the temperature rises by 6 degrees Celsius, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is a temperature we could reach by mid-century if we keep digging up and burning fossil fuels at our current rates. So it's possible that we could run out of oxygen to breathe. And I know that sounds ridiculously apocalyptic to say, but unfortunately it is a realistic possibility. So we are on the verge of destroying the balance of life that 4 billion years of natural evolution has given us. But who is we? Isn't it each one of us? In our everyday lives, we are constantly dropping banana peels. That is, we are constantly causing more carbon to go into the atmosphere, and as a consequence, disrupting the natural cycles, and therefore causing suffering in human communities all around the world.
Everything is interconnected. Relationships take place at the atomic and the molecular level, between plants and animals, with humans and the entire ecosystem of which we are a part. And I think we have to realize that our inability to recognize the interconnections is to blame, at least in part, for ecological crises such as climate change, because we have been blinded to the effects that our daily actions have on the human and non-human networks that are linked to us. And Pope Francis in particular has been emphasizing this point. He wants us to recognize that since everything is interconnected, when we break the connections, there are consequences. Now, there are also spiritual interconnections. And I bet that you never thought in a climate change lecture you'd see this beautiful artwork from the Sistine Chapel. But there are spiritual connections, and because we are spiritual creatures as human beings, we're a union of body and spirit, mind and soul, intellect and will. And as humans, we're unique in having an interior nature that is capable of analysis, reflection, and understanding and of science as we know it. So given these interconnections, one wonders if the exterior maladies we see in the natural world are reflecting something interiorly disordered in us.
Wait a minute. That sounded really profound. Can you say that again?
We've rehearsed this about 5 times.
No, this really is profound. You need to say it again.
Okay, so is it possible that the exterior maladies of the natural world are reflecting something interiorly disordered in us? And I think this is what Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI meant in 2008 when he said, "The exterior deserts are growing because the interior deserts have become so vast." And as Pope Francis pointed out in Laudato Si, when we break these interconnections, we cause damage to natural ecologies, but also to our interior ecologies. And so separating ourselves from nature impoverishes our interior selves and causes interior deserts to form. There can be no renewal of our relationship with nature without a renewal of humanity itself, says Pope Francis. If this is the case, then we need to search within ourselves for the roots of the climate change crisis. Where are our interior deserts? What do we need to heal or renew within ourselves and in our culture so that we can stop causing climate change, so that we can stop tossing planetary banana peels?
So this strikes me as a really, really important question because, a lot of us have been talking for years about the need to get serious about mitigating climate change. And so far too few actions are actually being taken. So you got to wonder, is this lack really because we are ignoring our interior deserts? And if so, how do we go about healing them?
Well, we can't force people to change. We have to take them on a journey through their inner deserts with the conviction that inner growth can lead to meaningful exterior action. And so this evening, we propose to take you on such a journey via a step-by-step process that we sisters have developed over the years and that Sister Colleen Ann mentioned at the beginning that our Mother Sean was very instrumental in introducing to us. And this process helps guide us through personal spiritual development and conversion. And what we would like to do tonight is apply that process to the ecological conversion needed to address the climate challenge. The process helps break down what would be a very complex journey into 7 bite-sized steps, which are on one side of the cards at your places, so that it's actually doable. And each step is called an age to emphasize that it's a growth process with different developmental stages. The first age is what we call a new beginning. So in any process of development or conversion, there needs to be an awakening to something new and a desire for a new beginning. In relation to climate change, in this beginning phase, we need to become aware of the interconnections of which we've been speaking and where we have broken them. We have to become conscious of our actions and their consequences. Oh my gosh, I dropped a banana peel and someone might slip on it and fall.
So to me, the external connections are obvious, right? We drive cars that burn gasoline. We use electricity that was made by burning coal or natural gas. This all adds carbon dioxide to the air, which traps heat, makes our planet get warmer, drives storms, floods, fires, and all the other disasters associated with climate change. But what about the internal connections? In church, we pray for the victims of the floods and fires, and quite appropriately, we take up collections to help them recover. But we never seem to pray for ourselves, to pray for forgiveness for our complicity in having caused those disasters in the first place. So what is it in the culture of our present society that prevents us from becoming conscious of our role in the climate crisis, of seeing our own internal deserts?
And that's such a key question, Phil. And I think in response, there could be many answers, but I see maybe 3 main cultural separations that act as barriers to us seeing our internal deserts. They, in effect, prevent us from seeing the disorders within us that are then reflected in the way that we treat the world around us. And so the first barrier is the separation of the physical and material from the spiritual. This weakens and eventually breaks the links between faith and life. And at its most extreme, this separation removes God from our lives. And from there, it's so easy to get caught living materialistic lives with little or no sense of anything transcendent. We live in a culture that emphasizes self-gratification through consumerism, technology, and various addictive and escapist activities. And then I think the second barrier follows on the first, the separation of truth from reality. Because we also live in a culture that prizes relativism. Whatever you think is your truth, and whatever I think is my truth, and there is not much space for God's truth. Then each person gets caught in thinking, how can I impose my truth on someone else? Which leads to arguments with no resolution because everyone has forgotten that the real truth is God's truth.
Yeah. So my daughter, being a good millennial, said to me recently, if you want to believe in God and I don't, that's fine. You do you and I'll do me. Does that sound like you're a teenager? No, I said, it can't be true that God exists if I say so, and God doesn't exist if you say so, right? Either God exists or God doesn't exist. It can't be both ways. So our job is to discern which it is. And the worst thing is to just let it go and not try to find out.
And the same holds true for moral truths. So in the scriptures it says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And we need to become aware of the temptation to become kind of interiorly lukewarm in relation to moral truths, especially when it comes to the intrinsic dignity and goodness of all creatures. And when we profess the value of every living creature, and some of you know who the famous one is on this slide, Nebby the lizard. When we were working with this, we called this Nebby's sermon, this little part that I'm about to say.
Because it is what he would have said. Those of you who know him know that.
Okay, so when we profess the value of every living creature, the bluebird, the butterfly, the lizard, then if we take another step, protecting an unborn child follows right on that, and it's really a no-brainer, because we need to care for and protect all life. And this also means that we need to work with nature rather than against it. And so I think one example that we could look at of working against nature is something like contraception, which is an artificial chemical way of controlling reproduction. Natural family planning, on the other hand, works with natural cycles rather than trying to artificially control them. And that's another way, I think, of looking at that question. Now, the third barrier that I see is the separation of the person from the community. So as humans, we need each other. However, we are now suffering from a crisis of isolationism. We've become separated from our communities, starting with the breakdown of the family. We live in a self-centered culture, concerned about our own individual needs and unaware of the needs of our neighbors. And in fact, often we don't know who our neighbors are.
Okay, so you're saying that we've got three main separations, right? Materialism, relativism, isolationism. Great. With that said, what are we going to do to heal them?
Well, I think before we can move into healing, we have to go through a stage of cognitive dissonance. And here we move into the tension of dependence, independence, and interdependence that defines the second age. In this age, we live in the tension of wanting to live our own lives, but at the same time knowing that we're dependent on others and that what we do affects others. I want to do whatever I want to do and have whatever I want to have. But sometimes what I want to do conflicts with what I should do for my neighbors or for the earth. And so the key interior step in this age is to become aware of the inner tension rather than just passing over it or dismissing it. Recognizing the tension is healthy because you can't resolve it until you've acknowledged the tension and worked through it.
All right, that's easy for you to say. But for many of us, taking the superficial shortcut is so much easier than actually recognizing the tension within us, right? So how do we come to a place where we can actually deal with that tension?
Well, resolving the tension requires moving into the third age, in which we are driven to take personal initiative and develop a stronger sense of personal responsibility for the community and for creation care. And to do this, I suggest the practice of a daily spiritual examen. We're in Lent now, and doing an examen is a good practice, especially during Lent. And the term examen comes from the Latin exigere, meaning to weigh accurately. And the daily examen is a process of weighing the day's events to ascertain how one's attitudes and behaviors measure up to certain moral principles. So the examen is a technique of prayerful reflections on the events of the day in order to evaluate your conduct and become more aware of God's presence in your daily life. It's kind of like looking into the window of your soul. I think that, could you do the slide? Okay. The examen helps identify those areas where we've been selfish, materialistic, or indifferent and haven't taken responsibility for caring for creation. In Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, his discussion of the ecology of daily life can give us a structure for a daily examen. And as I read it, the ecology of daily life relates to three main areas: our physical spaces, our bodies, and our daily actions. And so the daily examen can help us see our failings in these areas, the places where we haven't measured up, so we can begin to change our lives. And so some questions you might want to ask yourself in your daily examen include, and they are on the back of your cards, which are takeaways for you. But in relation to your physical spaces, what do my physical surroundings look like? Are they clean or messy, pristine or polluted? Do they promote or do they break interconnections? Do they increase a sense of belonging and bring about an experience of community? So that's our physical spaces. The second area are our bodies in relation to our bodies. How do I treat my body and the bodies of others? Do my daily behaviors put my body in a healthy or a diseased relationship with the earth? Do I care well for my body and for the bodies of other living things? And do I honor the natural laws in my body and in the bodies of the persons with whom I am in relationship? And then thirdly, in relation to our daily actions, where do they flow from? Do my daily acts flow from a throwaway mentality, selfish or violent attitudes, excessive consumption or indifference? Or do they flow from an attitude of attentiveness, love, and caring? And so the goal is really to live the ecology of daily life well in relation to our physical spaces, our physical environment, our bodies, and our daily actions. And I think committing to this kind of examen inspires us to do small acts of caring in our daily lives. And this is how we can begin to personally confront, in concrete ways, the cultural separations of materialism, relativism, and isolationism that we became aware of in the First Age.
So what you're suggesting is that once we do this examen and realize that our room is messy, maybe we'll clean it up? Well, there are plenty of small but important things we can do to help clean up the earth. We can recycle. That's my dog, Sundog, helping with the cause. We can turn off unneeded lights, turn down the thermostat, eat less meat, switch to a locally grown, organic, plant-based diet.
At Aquinas College, we have a zero waste initiative. From industrial composting to recycling of everything, from electronics to plastics to aluminum to paper to candy wrappers. About the only thing that needs to go into the trash on a daily basis is sandwich bags. And so when we became aware of that, we realized, well, we don't really need to use sandwich bags any longer. We can use reusable Tupperware instead. And as I tell our students and faculty, the Zero Waste Initiative benefits not only the earth, but each one of us as well, because practicing zero waste, I would say, is an exercise of virtue. Small acts done repeatedly for a good end. Pope Francis reinforces this when he says in Laudato Si that doing something small out of love for creation is a redemptive act and a way of holiness.
So I can see that these small steps are important for the earth and for us as individuals. But even if everyone takes them, it won't be enough to solve the climate problem. We need to think bigger. So how do we do that?
Well, that brings us to the fourth age, life commitment. So when you move into this stage of personal conversion, we're driven to make more permanent commitments. The action is motivated by deepening love more than by obligation. And so, Phil, wasn't it love for creation that drove you to take the actions you've taken in your own life on behalf of creation?
Well, I suppose so, even though I hadn't consciously realized it at the time. But it was after doing a carbon footprint exercise with one of my classes that I began to think seriously about reducing my own carbon footprint because, frankly, it seemed hypocritical not to. So I decided that I would address one major issue each year, starting with the largest carbon emissions and then working down to the smaller ones. So first it was replacing the furnace and water heater with the highest efficiency models possible, since they had to be replaced anyway. And then it was getting a hybrid car, which I show you mostly so I can show off my license plate. Do you like it? Sad thing is, it's the only car in Indiana that has that license plate. Last year it was installing solar panels, which got put up as kind of a patio roof, and in case you can't see, that yellow thing is a frisbee being held by a black dog standing in the shadow. But I was genuinely surprised at how good it felt to do these things. To know that as I go about my daily life, I'm no longer causing as much harm to people all over the globe. And so to go on this year, I'm working on changing my diet, which is admittedly causing a certain amount of grumbling. I'm grateful for the bishop's dispensation this evening. But it's important to make life decisions based on caring for others and on what is, oh, no, it's me. Are we here? It's my fault. I hit the mute button on the bottom. Sorry. Okay, so it's important to make life decisions based on caring for others and on what is good for the planet. But the nice thing is that in doing so, it's often better for me personally too. I mean, with this change in diet, I'm going to get healthier whether I want to or not. But even if we do all these things, it still won't be enough to solve the climate problem. It will make a big difference, but there are severe limits on what we can do as individuals unless we also make changes as a community, all right? So how do we cause these community level changes to happen?
And so here again, the sequence can help us, so we turn to the next stage for some insights. So when our interior convictions get strong enough, we begin to dispossess in the sense of decreasing our attention to our own individual needs and increasing our attention to the needs of the community. And this is the fifth age, where I am willing to make personal sacrifices in order to bring something new forth for the good of others and of the community.
So this is maybe something like bringing forth a child? I mean, suddenly all attention is on the child, even at the expense of your own needs and wants, which seem to be mostly for sleep and money. In the context of climate change, perhaps a good example is the recent community effort in South Bend to pay for and install solar panels on the roof of Our Lady of the Road, the Catholic Workers' House in South Bend. I call these stone soup solar panels because it was a Notre Dame student, Emily Clements, who dedicated herself at the expense of many other things she could have been doing to get solar panels up there. So she talked engineers into doing the design work. She got Notre Dame alums to donate the panel. She got community volunteers to do the actual installation. And as a result, the sacrifices of many people led to something new and beautiful. Homeless people doing their laundry and taking showers while having greatly reduced the amount of carbon they put into the air and having greatly reduced Our Lady of the Road's cost for paying those energy bills.
This makes me think of Pope Francis's call to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Yeah, it does. But you know what I'm going to say, right? Even these isolated community groups, here and there, are still not enough to solve the climate crisis. So how are we going to get more widespread long-term actions?
I'm very tired at this point.
I'm glad I have her to keep asking, how do we do this?
This points us to the sixth age. And in the sixth age, we develop the dedication that we must have to be in this for the long haul. And I think at this level of maturity, we allow our individual needs to be given over for the good of the larger community. And this doesn't mean that we lose our freedom, but rather acting out of love, we intentionally choose to make a deeper long-term commitment to the common good. And applying this to tonight's discussion, it seems the press in this age is to form intentional communities dedicated to long-term solutions to the climate crisis.
Okay, so maybe this is something like the quest for international cooperation on mitigating climate change that was solidified at the COP21 summit in Paris like 3 years ago. So here, as you know, all the nations of the world, save two, came to an international agreement on taking steps to hold global warming to less than 2 degrees C above the historical average. That's great. But there are two hidden fatal flaws in this agreement. First of all, half of the atmospheric greenhouse gas reductions are supposed to come from carbon capture and sequestration, that is, filtering the carbon out of the air and storing it someplace. Unfortunately, technologies for doing so on a large scale do not currently exist, and in my opinion, probably never will exist because of the cost and the energy burden required to capture the carbon dioxide. Secondly, it's taking years for the parties involved to ratify the agreement and get to work. And the cost of delay is substantial. For every 10 years that you delay getting to work, the peak temperature of the Earth is going to be another 0.5 degrees C higher. So in short, this international agreement seems to be too little and too late.
And I wonder if part of the problem with COP21 is that it took a purely secular approach. So the representatives of the different nations are caught in their own interests, and there's no incentive for any one country to subsume its needs over to a larger global body. What's needed is a true global community, and I'm convinced that the Catholic Church has a critical role to play in building one. It is the primary global organization with both the reach and moral authority to tackle complex problems like global climate change. And furthermore, without the deep-rooted spiritual grounding and resources of the Church, we won't be able to form the long-term intentional communities needed to effectively address climate issues.
So you must mean something like what Notre Dame Professor Emeritus of Business Leo Burke is doing in an unpublicized international action he is undertaking with Pope Francis and the Pope's right-hand man for Laudato Si, Cardinal Peter Turkson. And yes, I'm telling you things that have not been revealed publicly. But Leo told me about him, so I'll tell you. So what Professor Burke has done is he's arranged a series of meetings at the Vatican with the CEOs of the major oil companies from around the world. And they're there to discuss their corporate responses to climate change. And Leo tells me that the oil executives greatly appreciate having the privacy and the moral authority of the Church present at these meetings. And in that setting, they're very free to say that, yeah, they fully recognize the reality of climate change. And they know that they have to change their business models to become suppliers of renewable energy, both for the sake of the planet and also because they're going to run out of oil anyway at some point. And so they're working on a public statement that Leo hopes will come out of these meetings. And in the current draft, the oil executives are calling for a global tax on carbon. Yeah, they want to be taxed. Because if there's a global tax on carbon, that allows them to compete against each other with the goal of reducing their corporate carbon emissions. And the one who converts to becoming a renewable energy supplier first is the one who's going to win economically. So they want that. Now, the fact that this meeting was held at the Vatican is extremely important because it allowed the CEOs to think deeply and creatively about the ethical implications of their business models and how they might change them to help rather than hurt the planet.
I think that's great. And in addition to helping mitigate climate change, these kinds of initiatives will also help humanity. And I do think the key to making it all happen is the moral authority and the community resources that are available through the Church.
Yeah, Leo's real contribution was to have the vision to make these meetings happen, and it really was his idea. He went around the world meeting privately with each oil executive to convince them to come to the meetings and thereby form an intentional international community. It's almost as if he were an evangelist for mitigating climate change.
and being an evangelizing witness is the seventh age. And this final age calls us to be evangelizing witnesses out of whom it's like waves of goodness flow as individuals and as intentional communities to truly make change happen. So the kinds of things that Leo Burke and the church are doing on the global scale are the kinds of things we should also be doing at the local parish level. And Pope Francis does make it clear that we need to act at both the global and the local levels.
Okay, so in my parish, St. Pius X in Granger, Indiana, near South Bend, I'm part of a creation care team under the auspices of the Catholic Climate Covenant. And we're tasked with, in effect, being the climate evangelist for our parish. And we certainly caused a number of small things to happen, as might be expected in your age 3, but we have not achieved the kind of systemic changes you might expect for age 6. So perhaps bringing the kind of interior examen you're proposing here to more people in our parish would be what's needed to spur much greater actions. And by the way, we're going to do that experiment. I convinced her to come to our parish next month.
It's the interior conversion of heart that's important. And conversion is the business of parishes. And that's why they should be invested in this. And I can't say that strongly enough. And interior conversion is worthwhile in and of itself, and it's also necessary if we're going to make any real gains in solving the climate crisis. I think the only way to really make a difference is to do the interior work that's necessary to heal our interior deserts and really make change happen. Now, we Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist serve as evangelists for creation by inviting others to work with us on the land. And tonight, thanks to all of you, the proceeds from tonight will go to benefit our land programs. And for example, we have monthly work days on our land. We teach farm school to 5th graders from a number of Catholic schools in the diocese. And we provide hands-on experiences for many with special needs. We also have counseling services for people seeking to heal their inner deserts. And with all of these, we hope that the persons who come experience interior conversion and a deeper sense of God through working on the land and working side by side with us.
Which seems to me really important. Because certainly for me, most of the counseling I've experienced in our current society has been focused solely on external behavior modification. It doesn't get into true inner healing. It also seems to me to be extremely important for climate change because never before have I heard something that gets so profoundly to the spiritual heart of the matter on a person-by-person basis. So we indeed have to change people's hearts if we're going to make real progress. And so I hope that you take to heart what you've heard this evening.
And if you'd like to take this a step further, we're thinking of forming a group to meet with us regularly at the Franciscan Life Process Center to reflect on the kind of approach we've outlined here, to put into practice the daily Examen, and to explore ways to grow as an intentional community focused on creation care. So if you think you might be interested, please put your information on the cards that are on your tables. And whether or not you decide to join this particular group, I hope that you will join us in other activities at the Franciscan Life Process Center and also put the things that you've heard this evening into practice in your own personal lives.
Okay, so this now sounds like a really wonderful plan. I hope you all participate. If we all do these things, we just might make a difference. And at the very least, the next time you have a banana peel in your hands, maybe you'll toss it in a compost pile.
One of our students in the farm school this week accommodated us with this photo. So now we have some time for questions from anyone. And I think Sarah will bring the microphone so we can all hear the questions.
Okay, if Sarah's going to take that microphone, I'll come over here and we can share this one.
Okay.
There.
This question is for Dr. Phil. The meetings that you discussed at the Vatican involving the oil executives, I was just curious, did they also involve sort of the nationalized oil industries, say in a place like Venezuela? And I think about that. I've always worried about the free rider issue. Yeah. And just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. But no, the national oil companies, the oil production is owned by various governments, are not involved in this. This is all the independent business oil companies. Leo realizes that's a big omission. But his hope is that if he can get this ball rolling with the companies, then maybe through the pressure markets and all that, then the national companies will have to come on board. So we'll see. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a bit of an unusual question. At the beginning of the presentation, you spoke of one of the problems we're having right now in our culture is moral relativism. You know, my truth is my truth, and your truth is okay for you, but it's not my truth. Do you ever see that, or if it hasn't already bleeding over into kind of a physical relativism, where somebody might say, well, your science is okay for you, but it's not my science. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because that's the heart of this false debate over climate change, right? In fact, the so-called climate deniers have actually changed the language, right? Because they'll say things like, falsely, well, do you believe in climate change, right? And belief is the wrong word here, because it's not like you can decide it's not true and therefore it's not true, or I can decide it's true and therefore it is true. They've taken away the fact of the matter, that what we do as scientists is we look at actual data, right, and we analyze it. So permit me a small story with apologies to a friend of mine, but I got in this debate with a friend of mine at church who is a very, very conservative voter, and he was making all these claims about how climate change isn't true and citing all these facts. And for everything he cited, I told him exactly what was wrong with what he just said. And after a while, he got frustrated with me. He said, well, who's your source? And I sort of went, huh? And I realized, oh, he's like listening to his news stations and looking at the stuff that shows up on his computer, because Google, when you search, gives you more of what you've already seen. It never gives you anything different. So he thinks that I must be looking at some source that's telling him something different. He wanted to know who my source was. And after I realized that, I said, I look at the data, I understand the analyses, and I make my own conclusions. And that just floored him. Like, it never occurred to him that you could do that. And we've never had this argument since. So.
And I might also, in response to that, maybe nuance a little bit. So the science tells us what the truth of the matter is. Sometimes you need more time to get more data, right? And so that's how this started, I think, initially, was that it took time for the data to be put together. But there's so much data now from so many different sources that eventually you have to say, okay, this is pointing to the truth, right? So it isn't that science immediately gets to the truth, because it is an iterative process, and that might be where some of these things get caught.
Yeah, except I have to disagree with that at some point, because way back in the 70s, before we started collecting any of this Earth-observing data, we in the scientific community knew that this global warming was happening, and we knew what carbon dioxide was doing. In fact, we knew that starting in the 1800s were the first papers published on this. So it's not a mystery. And yeah, starting in like the 80s, we started building all the Earth-observing satellites, collecting all the data and all that. But really, the purpose of the data was A, to convince the rest of the world that we actually knew what we were talking about. Nothing in the data surprised anyone except that it's actually worse than we thought it was. And it allowed us to be a lot more specific. But a lot of times there are things that you know what's going on scientifically that it just takes a lot of work before you convince anyone else. But we've known this for a very, very long time.
I have to get just 2 more words in. No, we've known it, but I do think there is a value for society in the process of proving that, you know, and in being able to demonstrate. Because and even in my own process, I think of coming to understand climate change, I needed to hear the data as it developed. I had a sense, okay, this is happening, but I really did need to hear the data and understand the data. And I do think for those maybe who aren't scientists, it's very good that there's an iterative process there, and it also puts some limits on science too, to work within that framework of proving the truth of creation. That was a long answer to a good question.
Okay, so you guys talk about being less materialistic, which I agree with. I think everybody should. But when everyone stops being less materialistic and stops buying mass-produced things, doesn't that affect a lot of people working in factories? And when those shut down, a lot of people lose their jobs. I think when that eventually happens, if it does, how are we going to deal with the massive job loss and like people who don't have jobs anymore?
She looks at me.
Well, do you want to say anything?
Yeah. Yeah. So what you really pointed to is the false illusion that's generated by the fact that we measure our success as human beings by our GDP, our gross domestic product, right? But there are economists now who talk about a different kind of measure, a gross happiness index, right? Because it's true that the things that really make us happy are not the material things, and we just need to change the way we do things. So I think, yes, there would be a lot of job displacement, but hopefully a lot of better things for people to do, you know?
Yeah, and I imagine it would be a gradual process just by our nature, but we'd have to shift into more local economies, and job training would probably be involved in that way. And we wouldn't be measuring, as Phil said, so much just solely on economic measures, because I think we would need to develop other measures of success or happiness.
Yeah, oh, and there's one other point. Who is it that needs to dump their materialistic lifestyle, right? What if we actually shared the resources of the planet with all the people who really don't have roofs over their heads or enough food to eat? I think there's plenty of work to be done there. And so it's a takeoff on what Pope Francis says in Laudato Si about the food problem. You know, it's not true that we don't have enough food to support the global population. What's true is that we throw a third of it away, and we have a horrible distribution system for the rest of it. So, if we could bring everyone on the planet up to a comfortable but not materialistic lifestyle, then I think we're really getting someplace.
The other piece that I think I'd like to add to that, and know what the two of you might say about that, because I think the young lady who brought this up has a real point in terms of what people worry about a lot. But there's another piece of this that I think we don't hold out to one another as human beings, and that's that when there's a need, like if we let go of mass-produced things, right, then what would that do to challenge a lot of us to be more creative? And what would the two of you say about that? Because I think that's a whole thing that we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point, and that makes us more human too when we become more creative. And I wonder, on this whole notion of the interior and exterior in that play, when we're constantly taking in, mass-produced, homogenized things, how does that do we start to feel mass-produced and homogenized just in our interactions and in how we behave and the way that we treat other people? So if we were to start even changing those exterior things, I think it might then encourage us interiorly to think more creatively, and that takes more time. You can pump out a bunch of widgets in a really fast time once you develop the machines, but to do these other initiatives would take time. It would make us also bring into community, so bring us out of isolation, because we'd have to work with one another and the gifts. If we're designing a new product or something, we'd have to work with others who have those skills. So the creativity is absolutely essential. And I think what we're doing to ourselves when we move away from that into this mass production mode is actually compromising our capabilities as human beings. And what we need to do is enhance those capabilities so that we can move forward with these solutions. So we're not going to get the big creative solutions for climate change until we start working on some of this nitty-gritty stuff in our day-to-day lives too.
I was just wondering if there are any other faith-based organizations that you feel like are maybe living this that we can model after, or I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
I actually don't know of any. I know there are other faith-based organizations that are focused on solving climate change, but they, and even the Catholic Climate Covenant tend to be mostly focused on doing the external things. That's why I thought this was so unique, what I was hearing from Sister Damien Marie.
Yeah, and I think as a religious community, we really try to do this. I mean, when I'm up here speaking, I'm also speaking, as a Franciscan sister of the Eucharist, and this is our approach, and we try to do this with the lay people with whom we work. So we're one small group. We need a lot more. We really need to expand it, and that's why we made this invitation at the end too. Is if people are interested, could we talk together and form a little intentional community and see how could we be creative with this and how could we move this forward using the gifts of those who are interested.
Yeah. So I think the answer is you're the example. Yeah.
This has been very enlightening. Thank you for being here. When I look at what people believe, and people are entitled to believe whatever they like, there are people that still claim that cigarettes don't cause cancer, or that the Holocaust never occurred, or, believe it or not, that the climate change issues are a Chinese hoax. But what I see as the opportunities are what you just alluded to, and that is the phrase, it takes a village, to create enclaves or organizations that are supported so that they can look at, all right, what can we do and how can we do it? Individuals, I think, discount what they as an individual can do when you put 10 people pulling on the rope or 10 people with oars, you can accomplish an awful lot more. So I appreciate the idea that we do need to create ways to support each other. And in addition to that, change other people's attitudes. People don't want to believe, I don't think, in things that aren't true, but you can always find somebody that will support an attitude. But truth, I would like to think, wins out.
It does, but we learn truth through relationship too. So, we always want to stand up for the truth. I think probably everyone in this room would say that. We all learn the truth by those that we love who teach us. Sometimes we do from our own just figuring it out, but most of the time it's relational. And I think it's how do we develop trust relationships where we could share things and then eventually attitudes might change. But if someone comes in and, you know, tries to change your attitude right away, that isn't going to work. So I think living into a process like the one we shared helps to build relationships, and you work at each step. You know, and at some points in your life you're at one step, and at another point you're at another step, and then you're in relationship in different steps with people too. So I do think there is a lot of relationship work that needs to be done to change attitudes before we even get to the point of developing all these creative initiatives. But so it is all about relationship. I don't know if you want to.
A question for some of the younger people in the room, some of the millennials and the Generation Z. I'm looking on this card, and something that really kind of hit hard with me is a throwaway mentality. And for a lot of us, you know, the millennial and Gen Zs, everything that we've been raised with is throwaway. Our communication is throwaway. You know, we have Snapchat disappearing private messages that only last 10 seconds and they go away. Single-use plastics, and you know, when I eat lunch, I've got throwaway plastic silverware. How do we start? When all or most of what we've ever known has been throwaway, we've been raised with it. How do we start? It feels so daunting. What would you say?
Well, like everything else, I think you start where you are. We have students in Notre Dame who are heavily engaged in campaigns against single-use plastics. They've convinced they've convinced the main restaurants on our campus to stop using plastic silverware for anything, to get compostable takeout containers. They're working with some of our other eaters on this. They've been working with restaurants in town, and I mean, that's all you can do. You just have to take on the campaign. You know, you have to tell the server, no, I don't want that straw, and let it grow from there. And I think what's going on at Aquinas College is really exemplary in this effect. You know, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you do have to start small, but you also have to commit to do it. And so, you know, for example, when you take your lunch, take it in a reusable container, and it does take a minute or two to wash the container, but then you have it ready for the next time. And use regular silverware, you know, and there is compostable silverware, but there's regular silverware too that you can just wash. If you have a dishwasher, you can use that. So I think, and remember, plastics, there are many problems with plastics too. I mean, there are also many health effects. Some of the research that I was involved with, I'm not so much directly involved in research now, but I was with the endocrine disruption that's occurring as a result of the plastic residues and such that mimic hormones in our bodies that are causing serious health issues. And it's documented worldwide, all through the entire ecosystem up through human beings. So there's health effects too. So there's a good reason to be committed to this. And all plastics are also petroleum products. So the more plastics we use. So I think, again, as Phil says, you have to start small, but make the changes. You know, maybe say, okay, I'm going to work on my lunches, that I don't, you know, I just use reusable containers for my lunches. Then the next thing will come.
Yeah. And it also occurs to me, you know, in my own life, I absolutely hate putting anything in the garbage can. And if you're really careful, there are actually very few things that you need to put in the landfill. You know, most things can be recycled, so sometimes you have to work harder to find a place. You know, food waste can be composted. And the other thing about throwaways, right, all the stuff we buy now, nobody repairs it anymore, huh? Yeah. But when something breaks, you know, I first see if I can fix it. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. If I can't or it looks too daunting, you know, but it looks like someone could fix it, I'll give it to Goodwill. You know, don't just throw it away, or take it to the Habitat for Humanity Restore or someplace like that, so it might have another use. But I just hate doing it. And I can see the difference, because when I take my trash pail out to the curb, it's usually less than half full. And all my neighbors' cans are just overflowing onto the sidewalk. And I think this is ridiculous. So, you know, you start with what's in front of you.
If I could just add one short, and I do think it's a way to learn how to practice virtue. It's an analogy, because when you first start, you have to become aware of what you're doing, and then as you develop virtue, if you fall from it, you feel badly, right? And it's a similar feeling when you can't recycle. Like right now, because of zero waste, when I go places and I have to put something in the garbage that I know could be reused, I really do feel, I feel off, you know, and that's the feeling when you fall off of virtue. I mean, it's a way of learning virtue, and that might be a way of encouraging yourself to make the changes.
This will be our last question.
I was just wondering how CO2, can you explain how CO2 creates this warming? Because, you know, I worked with CO2 a lot in the 80s and 90s, and the baseline was 0.03, and now as I understand it, it's 0.04. So, can you explain, you know, how does that happens?
Yeah, it goes back actually to 1800s when John Tyndall was doing experiments on the transmission of light through different substances, and discovered that certain substances, particularly carbon dioxide, but also water vapor, some nitrous oxides, methane, they trap infrared radiation, okay? Since I understand you have technical knowledge here, is that they have absorption bands in the infrared, so infrared doesn't pass through a gas of carbon dioxide. So in our atmosphere, all of our heat comes from the sun, right? But it comes mostly as visible light and a little bit of ultraviolet. That comes down and heats the Earth. Then the Earth tries to re-radiate that heat back into space, but because the Earth is a relatively cool body, that re-radiation is in the form of infrared radiation, heat waves, if you will. And the carbon dioxide will absorb a good portion of that infrared radiation trying to leave, and that's how the heat gets trapped. So, it's a process.
A follow-up question to that would be, it's very interesting when you started the presentation that you said the atmosphere, you know, billions of years ago or whatever, was mostly CO2.
Yeah.
If that was the case, how would not the atmosphere be extremely warm at that time?
Well, it was. I mean, in deep history, it was a lot warmer. And then we got the era where we had ice ages, and now it's getting a little warmer again. And the point to me, though, is that we like temperatures the way that they, I don't want to say are now, but were, say, 50 years ago. Everything on the planet has evolved to live in the kind of temperature zone that we had. As we change that and the temperatures get higher, we're actually in danger of pushing all of the ecosystems on Earth into a temperature regime where they really can't thrive. So in addition to all the direct problems of climate change, right, there's species extinction, which is driven by a lot of factors, sure, but the changing climate, the warming of the Earth, is sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back and tends to push ecosystems out of existence. I don't know if you're aware, but the rate of species extinctions now is faster than at any other time in the known history of the Earth. So we're really doing a lot of damage.
Just a quick comment. I look around the table where I'm sitting, and the only non-compostable, non-reusable thing on this table are 3 little plastic cups for the dessert. I just want to say thank you for showing us an example of how to do this. That's really important, I think, that we call for the organizations that we're associated with to do it like this, and thanks for showing us how.
Yeah. Thank you. Good job. Thank you.